The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Bragg's training compound as William Iron Will Sullivan adjusted the collar of his faded but immaculate uniform. At 87 years old, his movements were deliberate and measured, but they carried the unmistakable precision of a lifetime of military discipline. His weathered hands, spotted with age but steady as bedrock, carefully placed his duffel bag on the ground outside the training facility. The sounds of young men engaged in rigorous physical training echoed from within. Will paused, taking a deep breath. This wasn't a decision he had made lightly, accepting a Commander Jackson's unusual invitation. But some opportunities, even at his age, especially at his age, couldn't be refused. Inside the facility, 30 Navy SEALs were arranged in formation, their muscular bodies glistening with sweat from their morning routine. Master Chief Derek Stone, 34 years old and at the peak of physical conditioning, stood at the front, his commanding presence keeping every eye focused on him. Stone's reputation preceded him: 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 in Iraq, and numerous classified operations across hostile territories. The scars on his arms and the unflinching intensity in his eyes told the story of a warrior who had seen the worst humanity had to offer and prevailed. Today begins our specialized training program. Stone announced, his voice carrying the natural authority of someone accustomed to life and death decisions. We're integrating some new elements into our combat techniques. Command believes we should explore all options, including— His voice trailed off as the door to the facility opened. Will Sullivan stood in the doorway, sunlight at his back, creating a momentary silhouette of his slender frame. As he stepped forward, the contrast between him and the young SEALs became starkly apparent. Where they were broad-shouldered and bulging with muscle, Will was lean and wiry. Where they radiated raw physical power, he carried himself with the quiet economy of movement that comes only from decades of experience. A ripple of whispers spread through the ranks. One SEAL leaned toward another, not bothering to lower his voice. "Looks like the Military History Museum lost one of their exhibits." Several others chuckled, their eyes taking in Will's aged appearance with undisguised skepticism. Stone's expression darkened as he strode toward the elderly man. "Can I help you?" Stone asked, his tone making it clear that whatever assistance he might offer would involve directing Will away from the facility. "Master Chief Stone," Will said, extending his hand. "William Sullivan. Commander Jackson is expecting me." Stone did not take the offered hand. "This is a restricted training facility for active Special Forces personnel. I'm afraid there must be some mistake." Will maintained his composed expression, lowering his hand without embarrassment. "No mistake. I've been invited to participate in your classical combat techniques program." The silence that followed was broken by more poorly suppressed laughter from the assembled SEALs. Stone's face remained impassive, but his eyes narrowed slightly. "Sir, with all due respect, this isn't a venue for Veterans Association tours. We're conducting specialized training here." Will met Stone's gaze steadily. "I'm well aware of that, son." The word "son" triggered something in Stone's expression, a flash of annoyance that he quickly masked. "Look," Stone said, his voice lowered but intensity increased. "This isn't a place for old war stories or nostalgia. These men are preparing for actual combat scenarios. Perhaps there's another program more suitable for your demographic." Before Will could respond, the side door opened and Commander Jackson entered, his attention focused on a clipboard in his hands. Looking up, he spotted Will and Stone standing in apparent confrontation. "Ah, Mr. Sullivan, you've arrived. Excellent." Jackson approached, extending his hand to Will with genuine respect. "I see you've met Master Chief Stone." Stone turned to Jackson, confusion and irritation evident in his posture. "Commander, you can't seriously expect this man to participate in our training program." "Not only do I expect it, Stone, I specifically requested it." Jackson turned to address the curious SEALs. "Gentlemen, this is William Sullivan. He'll be joining our program for the next week as both a participant and an advisor." The announcement was met with stunned silence, followed by murmurs of disbelief. Stone's jaw tightened visibly. "Commander, may I speak with you privately?" he asked, his voice tightly controlled. "Later, Stone." Jackson turned to Will. "Too. Mr. Sullivan, why don't you get settled while I brief the men on today's agenda?" As Will moved toward the side of the room with his bag, the scene shifted to Commander Jackson's office earlier that week. Jackson sat behind his desk, reviewing personnel files, when his aide announced an unexpected visitor from Central Command. Colonel Harris, a stern-faced officer from Special Operations Command, entered carrying a classified folder. Commander Jackson, thank you for seeing me on such short notice. Jackson rose. Colonel Harris, what brings special operations to my humble training facility? Harris placed the folder on Jackson's desk. A special directive from the top. We're implementing a new program to evaluate and potentially incorporate traditional combat techniques that may have been overlooked in our modern training. Traditional techniques, Jackson echoed, opening the folder. The military has become increasingly reliant on technology and modern weaponry, Harris explained. But recent operations have shown situations where these advantages are neutralized. We need operators who can adapt when technology fails. Jackson scanned the documents. And you want to run this program here? Fort Bragg has the necessary facilities and your SEAL unit has the right profile. Harris paused. There's one more thing. We have a specific advisor in mind for this program. He handed Jackson a second thinner file. When Jackson opened it, his eyebrows rose in surprise. William Sullivan, the William Sullivan. Harris nodded. Few people know that name anymore, which is exactly how he wanted it. But yes, the very same. He must be in his 80s now, Jackson said, scanning the heavily redacted service record. 87 and still in remarkable physical condition. He's maintained his training regimen every day for 60 years. Jackson looked up from the file. Ghost operators? I thought that was just a military legend. Most people do, Harris replied. That's what made them effective. Sullivan was their combat instructor for over 2 decades. 3 wars, countless classified operations, and techniques that have never been formally documented. Jackson closed the file, and he's agreed to this. He has one condition, Harris said. He wants to participate in the training, not just observe or instruct. Participate at his age. Jackson couldn't mask his surprise. I had the same reaction, Harris admitted, but his medical clearance came back better than men half his age. Don't let his appearance fool you, Commander. William Sullivan is possibly the most dangerous man you will ever meet. The scene returned to the present as Will placed his bag against the wall of the training facility. He could feel the eyes of the young SEALs on him, assessing, judging, dismissing. He'd seen that look many times before in Korea, in every conflict where young men thought age equated to weakness. Commander Jackson was outlining the week's training schedule, emphasizing hand-to-hand combat techniques, weapons proficiency under adverse conditions, and tactical adaptability. Stone stood rigid, his displeasure evident in every line of his body. For our first exercise, Jackson announced, we'll be running the enhanced obstacle course. Master Chief Stone currently holds the facility record at 4 minutes and 37 seconds. Stone's posture shifted subtly, pride momentarily displacing his annoyance. Jackson continued, Mr. Sullivan will demonstrate first to give us a baseline for adapting traditional techniques to modern challenges. A smirk crossed Stone's face as he turned to Will. Sir, perhaps you'd prefer to observe this round. The course can be quite demanding, even for conditioned operators. Oh, Will met Stone's gaze with the calm assurance of a man who had faced far worse than patronizing young officers. I believe I'll manage. 20 minutes later, the entire unit stood at the starting line of the obstacle course. It was an imposing series of challenges, walls to scale tunnels, to navigate ropes to climb, all designed to push even elite soldiers to their physical limits. Will had changed into simple training attire, olive drab pants, and a faded gray t-shirt that revealed arms that, while thin, showed the sinewy strength of decades of disciplined fitness. More noticeable were the scars, evidence of wounds from conflicts long since relegated to history books. Stone approached, making a show of explaining the course. You start with the wall climb, then navigate the barbed wire crawl. After that, it's the rope traverse over the water pit, followed by the vertical climb and monkey bars. The final section is the balance beam and sprint to the finish. Will nodded, taking in the course with an experienced eye. Don't feel obligated to complete the entire course. Stone added, loud enough for the others to hear. Medical assistance is available if needed. More chuckles from the watching SEALs. Will ignored them, focusing on his breathing, centering himself as he had done countless times before missions. Commander Jackson raised the starting pistol. On my mark, 3, 2, 1. The shot rang out and Will was moving before the echo faded. His start wasn't explosive like a younger man's might be, but it was efficient, each stride measured and deliberate. He reached the wall and began to climb, not with raw strength, but with perfect technique, finding hand and foot holds that others might miss. The SEALs watched, initially amused, then increasingly attentive, as Will navigated each obstacle with unexpected proficiency. Where they relied on strength, he used leverage. Where they powered through, he found the path of least resistance. The barbed wire crawl, a test of endurance that left most men's arms burning with fatigue, seemed almost effortless, as Will employed a rolling technique rarely seen outside specialized training. Stone's expression shifted from dismissive to puzzled, then to concerned, as Will maintained a steady, relentless pace. The rope traverse, often a stumbling point for even experienced operators, posed no challenge, as Will moved across with the balance and coordination of someone who had done this thousands of times. By the time Will reached the vertical climb, the facility had fallen silent. Even the most skeptical observers could see they were witnessing something extraordinary. Not the desperate struggle of an old man trying to keep up, but the fluid efficiency of a master demonstrating his craft. Will completed the course, crossing the finish line with steady breath and focused eyes. Commander Jackson checked his stopwatch, then checked it again, his expression revealing his astonishment. 4 minutes and 45 seconds, 8 seconds off the record, set by a man less than half his age at the peak of physical conditioning. The silence that followed was profound. Stone stared at the readout on Jackson's watch, his face a mask of disbelief. Several of the younger SEALs exchanged glances, reassessing the elderly man who stood before them, barely winded. "Impressive," Stone finally said, though his tone suggested he found it anything but, "for someone of your experience." Will accepted a towel from Commander Jackson, wiping his face with the same methodical precision that characterized all his movements. "The course is well designed, tests the right attributes." Stone's jaw tightened at what he perceived as a professional assessment from someone he considered an outsider. "Tomorrow's exercises will be more technically demanding. Less about physical endurance, more about combat proficiency." Will nodded, looking forward to it. As the group dispersed for their next training rotation, one young SEAL approached Will, extending a water bottle. "That was something else, sir. I've never seen anyone take the rope traverse with that technique." Will accepted the water with a nod of thanks. "Old school. Developed it in Korea when we had to cross rivers under fire. Uses less energy." "Korea?" The young man Miller, according to his uniform, looked surprised. "You were in the Korean War." "Among others," Will said simply. Miller seemed about to ask more questions when Stone called sharply from across the room. "Miller, training rotation now." The young man hurried away, but not before giving Will a respectful nod. It was a small gesture, but in Will's experience, respect always began with a single crack in the wall of preconception. As the afternoon progressed, the training shifted to weapons familiarization. The SEALs rotated through stations featuring various firearms, practicing disassembly, reassembly, and troubleshooting under pressure. Will moved through the rotations quietly, his hands working with practiced familiarity on weapon systems that had evolved significantly since his active duty days. Stone observed from a distance, his attention divided between supervising the unit and watching the old man who had so unexpectedly disrupted his training program. When Will encountered a newer model assault rifle, Stone moved closer, expecting, perhaps hoping to see him struggle. Instead, Will methodically examined the weapon, identifying the evolutionary changes from systems he knew, then proceeded to disassemble and reassemble it with practiced precision. His hands moved with the assurance of someone who understood not just the mechanics, but the underlying principles of firearms design. "Different configuration," Will noted to the instructor at the station, "but the operating principle remains consistent with the older models." Stone interjected, "Modern combat requires familiarity with current technology. Historical knowledge has limited application in today's battlefields." Will looked up, meeting Stone's challenging stare. "The fundamentals never change, son. Only the packaging." Again that word "son" and the subtle tightening around the Stone's eyes that it provoked. "The fundamentals have evolved significantly," Stone countered. "Today's special operators face threats and employ techniques that would be unrecognizable to previous generations." Will's weathered face remained impassive, but something flickered behind his eyes. Not anger, but something closer to disappointment. Human conflict changes its face, not its nature. Forget that, and all your advanced training won't save you when things go sideways. Their exchange was interrupted by Commander Jackson announcing the day's final exercise, a tactical scenario in the simulation building. The unit would divide into teams to clear a multi-room structure containing both hostile targets and civilians. Sullivan to Jackson called, You'll observe this run. Give us your assessment afterward. Will nodded, but Stone stepped forward. With respect, Commander, if Mr. Sullivan is here to participate in all aspects of training, perhaps he should join one of the teams. The challenge in Stone's voice was unmistakable. Jackson hesitated, looking at Will. I'm happy to observe, Will offered, though I suspect Master Chief Stone has a particular lesson in mind. Stone's smile didn't reach his eyes. I believe hands-on experience is always more valuable than theoretical observation. Jackson considered it for a moment, then nodded. Very well. Sullivan, you'll join Team 2. Stone will lead Team 1. Standard CQB rules of engagement. As the teams prepared, donning tactical gear and checking simulation weapons, Miller approached Will again. Sir, have you done much close quarters battles training? Will checked the laser simulation system attached to his weapon. Some. Different terminology back then. We just called it room clearing. Miller lowered his voice. Just so you know, Master Chief Stone always uses these exercises to make a point. His team never loses, and he's not gentle about it. Will nodded. Appreciated. The simulation began with Team 2 entering the structure from the rear, while Team 1 entered from the front. The building was dark with strobe lights simulating disrupted power and smoke machines creating limited visibility. Recorded sounds of chaos, screaming gunfire explosions added to the disorientation. Will moved with his team, not taking the lead but maintaining perfect position in their formation. When they reached the first junction, the team leader signaled for them to split up. 2 men left, 2 right. Will was paired with a young SEAL named Thompson heading down the right corridor. The first hostile target appeared suddenly emerging from a side room. Thompson reacted quickly, but his shot went wide in the strobing darkness. Will's response was a single precision shot center mass. Clean, Thompson said, impressed despite himself. They proceeded, methodically clearing 2 more rooms without incident. As they approached a stairwell, Will suddenly raised his hand in the universal signal to stop. Thompson froze, trusting the gesture despite his uncertainty about the old man. Will pointed to a nearly invisible tripwire across the stairwell entrance, a simulated explosive device that would have registered multiple casualties had they triggered it. How did you spot that in this light? Thompson whispered. Will tapped his temple. You learn to feel these things after a while. They carefully navigated around the trap and proceeded upstairs, where they rejoined the rest of Team 2. The team leader was discussing their approach to the final rooms when gunfire erupted from the adjacent hallway. Team 1 had engaged multiple hostile targets. As planned, Team 2 moved to support, entering a large open room from the side entrance. The scenario had been designed for this convergence, creating a complex final encounter requiring coordination between the teams. What wasn't planned was Stone deliberately maneuvering his team to claim all the prime firing positions, effectively forcing Team 2 into exposed locations. It was a calculated move in what was supposed to be a cooperative exercise. The team leader hesitated, recognizing the tactical disadvantage, but unsure how to proceed without creating an unsafe training environment. Will placed a hand on his shoulder. Western corner, Chevalier, he said quietly. Blind spot in their coverage. The team leader looked where Will indicated and nodded. He directed his team to reposition using an approach that Stone's team hadn't anticipated. The maneuver succeeded, allowing Team 2 to clear their sector efficiently while remaining protected from potential crossfire. Stone, recognizing his advantage had been neutralized, pressed his team to accelerate their pace, taking increasingly aggressive positions. In his determination to outperform Team 2, he missed a hidden hostile target positioned behind concealment. Will spotted the threat just as Stone moved into its line of fire. Without hesitation, he called out, "Stone, drop!" Years of training took over, and Stone instantly dropped to a knee. Will's shot passed over him, neutralizing the target that would have registered a lethal hit on Stone. When the exercise concluded, both teams had successfully cleared the building with minimal simulated casualties. But there was no mistaking that Team 2's performance had been exceptional, largely due to Will's subtle guidance and situational awareness. As they exited the building, Stone approached Will. The younger man's expression was difficult to read, a mixture of grudging respect and deepening suspicion. That was a solid call in there, Stone acknowledged. Not many people would have spotted that last target from your position. Will shrugged. Just a matter of recognizing the patterns. Human behavior is predictable, even in chaos. And the tripwire, Stone pressed. Thompson said you spotted it in near darkness. You feel them more than see them, Will said, a certain tension in the air. Stone studied him with narrowed eyes. Who exactly were you with? Your service record mention only shows conventional infantry assignments. Before Will could answer, Commander Jackson called the unit together for debriefing. As the SEALs gathered, one of the younger men noticed something on Will's forearm. When he rolled up his sleeve, a faded tattoo mostly hidden by the fabric but momentarily visible. The SEAL nudged Miller, whispering, "Did you see that ink on the old guy's arm?" Miller shook his head. "Looked like some kind of unit insignia I've never seen before. Something with a skull and dagger." Miller's eyes widened slightly. He had seen that symbol before in his grandfather's personal effects, a patch so old the fabric had nearly disintegrated, kept in a box with medals and photographs from a war long past. His grandfather had never explained it, except to say it belonged to the men who fought in shadows. As Jackson concluded the day's briefing, Stone announced that tomorrow would focus on hand-to-hand combat techniques. Physical confrontation remains a critical skill set, Stone emphasized. When technology fails or circumstances prevent the use of firearms, an operator must be able to neutralize threats with only the weapons nature provided. His eyes fixed on Will as he added, "It's a young man's discipline requiring speed, strength, and agility. But perhaps Mr. Sullivan can share some historical perspectives on how these techniques were employed in previous eras." The challenge was unmistakable. Several SEALs exchanged knowing looks, anticipating the next day's entertainment. Will listened impassively, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. But as the unit dispersed for the evening, he caught Miller looking at him with newfound curiosity. That night in the Spartan visitor quarters assigned to him, Will removed his shirt to tend to the day's accumulated aches. His body told the story of a lifetime of service, scars from bullets, shrapnel, and blades crisscrossed his torso and arms. Most prominent was a star-shaped scar near his heart, where a bullet had nearly ended his journey decades ago. He pressed his fingers to this old wound, feeling the familiar phantom pain that always intensified with exertion. Field surgery in a jungle clearing in 1968, no anesthetic, a fellow operator digging the bullet out while enemy forces searched nearby. The mission had been officially disavowed, the men involved sworn to secrecy for the rest of their lives. Will opened his small duffel bag, removing a weathered leather case. Inside was a faded photograph of 5 men in nondescript uniforms, their faces young but their eyes old beyond their years. No insignia, no identification. Ghost operators existed in the spaces between official military operations, conducting missions so sensitive that even their existence was classified. He traced his finger across the faces of his long-dead comrades. "One more mission, boys," he murmured. "One last lesson to teach." As he returned the photo to its case, his attention was drawn to another item, a worn medallion on a simple chain. Not a military decoration, but something far more personal. A reminder of why he had accepted Commander Jackson's invitation, why he was subjecting his aged body to the rigors of training with men young enough to be his grandchildren. Some lessons could only be taught by example. Some truths could only be demonstrated through action. And William Sullivan had one final truth to impart before his time was done. Tomorrow would bring hand-to-hand combat training, Stone's deliberate attempt to expose what he perceived as Will's greatest weakness. The young Master Chief had no way of knowing that he was challenging a man who had spent 7 decades perfecting the art of close-quarters combat, who had trained the most elite shadow warriors in techniques never documented in any military manual. Will closed his eyes, centering his thoughts and preparing his mind for what was to come. In the quiet darkness of his quarters, he began the breathing exercises that had sustained him through countless missions. His heart rate slowed, his muscles relaxed, and his mind achieved the perfect clarity that had kept him alive when so many others had fallen. The real test would begin tomorrow. Not just of his physical abilities, which he harbored no illusions about age, extracted its price, regardless of discipline, but of something far more important, whether the young men of today's military could recognize and value the wisdom that only experience could provide. Whether Stone in particular could overcome his pride long enough to learn what Will had come to teach. As sleep finally claimed him, Will's last thoughts were of promises made long ago to men now gone. Promises that even at 87 years old he intended to keep. Dawn broke over Fort Bragg with the promise of another sweltering day. William Sullivan was already awake, performing a series of stretching exercises that had been part of his morning routine for over 60 years. His movements were deliberate and precise, focusing on flexibility and balance rather than strength. In his experience, combat was more about body control than raw power, a lesson few young fighters ever truly internalized. The training facility buzzed with anticipation as the SEALs gathered for the day's hand-to-hand combat instruction. Several cast sidelong glances at Will as he entered, their expressions ranging from amusement to genuine curiosity. Yesterday's performance on the obstacle course had raised questions, but today's close combat training would provide definitive answers about the old man's capabilities. Master Chief Stone stood at the center of the training mat, his powerful frame accentuated by a tight-fitting t-shirt that revealed arms corded with muscle. He projected absolute confidence as he surveyed the assembled men. Combat situations rarely unfold as planned. Stone began, his voice carrying throughout the facility. When your primary weapons fail or become inaccessible, you must rely on the most fundamental weapon system available, your own body. Will positioned himself toward the back of the group, listening attentively. Stone's principles were sound, if somewhat rigidly presented. The young Master Chief clearly favored techniques that emphasized speed and power attributes that naturally diminished with age. Modern close-quarters combat incorporates elements from various martial disciplines. Stone continued, demonstrating a series of fluid striking combinations. But we've refined these techniques specifically for battlefield applications, eliminating flashy movements that waste energy or expose vulnerabilities. As Stone moved through his demonstration, Will noticed subtle inefficiencies in his form, small details that wouldn't matter against an inferior opponent, but could prove fatal against an equal or superior fighter. The positioning of his feet, the slight telegraph before certain strikes, the unnecessary tension in his shoulders. After completing his demonstration, Stone scanned the room, his eyes eventually settling on Will. "Mr. Sullivan, perhaps you'd assist me in demonstrating these techniques for the group." The invitation wasn't unexpected. Will had anticipated this confrontation from the moment he stepped into the facility yesterday. He moved forward without hesitation, taking his position opposite Stone on the training mat. "The purpose of this demonstration," Stone announced to the watching SEALs, "is to illustrate how proper technique allows for adaptation to different physical attributes and limitations." The implication was clear. Stone intended to showcase how his superior strength, speed, and agility would overcome whatever outdated techniques Will might employ. It was a calculated move to reassert his authority after yesterday's surprising developments. "We'll start with basic defensive postures," Stone said, assuming a fighting stance. "Mr. Sullivan, if you'd attempt a standard front strike." Will nodded, settling into his own stance, one noticeably different from the modern military combative positions Stone had demonstrated. It was lower, more balanced, reminiscent of traditional martial arts, but with subtle modifications. "This isn't a traditional karate tournament," Stone commented, drawing a few chuckles from the watching SEALs. "Military combatives are specifically designed for—" His words cut off as Will moved not with the hesitant motion of someone following instructions for a demonstration, but with the fluid precision of a lifelong practitioner. The strike wasn't particularly fast by objective standards, but its timing was impeccable, catching Stone slightly off balance as he spoke. Stone blocked the strike but was forced to take a small step backward to maintain his position, a minor concession, but one not lost on the observant SEALs. "Good," Stone said, masking his surprise with a professional nod. "Now let's demonstrate a counter-response." What followed was ostensibly a training demonstration, but rapidly evolved into something more complex. Stone would initiate an attack sequence, which Will would defend against using techniques unfamiliar to most of the watching operators. When Will would counter, Stone would find himself responding to movements that didn't follow the patterns his body had been trained to expect. "Notice how I'm using his momentum against him," Stone explained to the group while simultaneously blocking Will's counterstrikes. "Size becomes irrelevant when you understand leverage and timing." But the watching SEALs began to notice something that Stone himself seemed reluctant to acknowledge. The old man wasn't being dominated in this exchange. His movements were economical, precise, and occasionally forced Stone to adjust his own approach. As the demonstration continued, Stone gradually increased the intensity, his blocks becoming more forceful, his counterattacks more aggressive. What had begun as an instructional session was evolving into something more competitive. "Try harder, Sullivan," Stone called out, his voice carrying a hint of challenge. "In real combat, your opponents won't hold back just because you're older. Will's expression remained impassive, but something changed in his eyes, a sharpening of focus, a deeper concentration. He began to incorporate techniques that hadn't been covered in Stone's instruction movements, that seemed to flow from one to another with an internal logic incomprehensible to the observers. Stone found himself increasingly on the defensive, his greater strength and speed neutralized by Will's superior positioning and timing. The older man never overcommitted, never extended himself beyond his capacity to recover, and somehow anticipated Stone's movements with uncanny accuracy. The assembled SEALs watched in growing amazement. They had expected an old man to be humbled by their commanding officer. Instead, they were witnessing what could only be described as a master class in combat efficiency. Stone, recognizing that the demonstration had veered far from his intended outcome, attempted to reassert control. "That's enough for basic demonstration purposes. Let's move on to—" Will interrupted with a movement so subtle and swift that few in the room actually saw it. A minute. Shift in weight, a slight redirection of Stone's forward momentum, and suddenly the Master Chief was off balance, forced to take 3 rapid steps to prevent himself from falling. The training room fell silent. Stone regained his composure quickly, but the damage was done. The unthinkable had happened. Their commanding officer had been outmaneuvered by an elderly civilian. "Interesting technique," Stone said, his voice tight. "Not standard military doctrine." "No," Will agreed. "Much older." Stone's jaw clenched momentarily before he addressed the room. "This demonstrates an important principle: the unexpected can be an advantage in itself. Your enemies may employ unorthodox methods that don't conform to your training." It was a professional recovery, but everyone present understood what had actually transpired. As the SEALs broke into pairs to practice the techniques Stone had demonstrated, the Master Chief approached Will privately. "You've had advanced training beyond standard military hand-to-hand combat." He observed, his tone carefully neutral. "Yes," Will replied honestly. "I've studied various combat systems throughout my career." "And which disciplines?" "Several traditional forms, expedited for practical application, plus some systems that don't have formal names." Stone studied him with narrowed eyes. "Tomorrow we'll be conducting more advanced exercises involving tactical decision-making under pressure. I hope you're prepared to continue your participation." The way he emphasized the final word made it clear this was no longer about inclusion or respect for a veteran. This had become personal. As the morning session concluded, Miller approached Will while Stone was occupied with other instructors. "Sir, that was incredible," the young SEAL said quietly. "I've never seen anyone handle the Master Chief like that." Will shrugged. "Experience has its advantages." Miller glanced around, ensuring no one else was within earshot. "That tattoo on your arm, I've seen that symbol before." "My grandfather had a patch with the same design." Will's expression remained neutral, but his eyes sharpened with interest. "Did he tell you what it meant?" "Only that it belonged to men who fought in shadows. He never explained further." Miller hesitated. Will nodded slowly. "What was his name?" "James Miller. 3rd Group, later transferred to a unit he never named." Recognition flickered in Will's eyes. "Good man, steady under pressure." Miller's eyes widened. "You knew him?" "We crossed paths." Will offered nothing more, but the confirmation was enough to transform Miller's curiosity into something deeper. "Sir, Miller Stone's sharp voice cut through their conversation. "If you're finished socializing, we have a tactical briefing in 5 minutes." Miller straightened immediately. "Yes, Master Chief." As Miller departed, Will caught Stone watching their interaction with obvious disapproval. The dynamics were shifting. What had begun as simple dismissal of an old man had evolved into something more complex: suspicion, competitiveness, and perhaps something close to concern. The afternoon brought a new challenge. Commander Jackson assembled the unit for a specialized firearms exercise designed to test adaptability under adverse conditions. The SEALs would rotate through various stations, each presenting a different complication, firing while physically exhausted, using unfamiliar weapon systems, operating with limited visibility, and compensating for simulated injuries. "Combat rarely allows for ideal conditions," Jackson explained. "The difference between success and failure often comes down to your ability to adapt when everything goes wrong." Stone took command of the exercise, organizing the rotations to ensure maximum training benefit. He assigned Will to begin at the station focused on unfamiliar weapons, modern systems that had entered service long after Will's active duty days. These weapons represent the latest battlefield technology, Stone explained, as Will examined an advanced assault rifle with integrated targeting systems. The learning curve can be steep even for experienced operators. Will assessed the weapon methodically, identifying the core operating mechanisms beneath the sophisticated exterior. The fundamentals remain consistent, he noted. Trigger control, breathing sight alignment, the technology changes, but the principles endure. Stone's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. The integration of advanced systems requires specialized training. Muscle memory from previous generations of weapons can actually impede adaptation. Will didn't argue, simply nodding and proceeding with the exercise. The station required operators to engage targets while using 3 different weapon systems they had never handled before with minimal familiarization time. As Will began, Stone watched with barely disguised anticipation of failure. The first weapon was a bullpup configuration assault rifle with a complex optics package significantly different from anything available during Will's era of service. To everyone's surprise, including the station instructor, Will handled the weapon competently. His shots weren't as tightly grouped as those of the SEALs who had trained on similar platforms, but they were consistently on target. More impressively, he managed the weapon malfunctions that had been deliberately introduced with calm efficiency. Impressive adaptability, the instructor commented. We'll transition to the second weapon, a next-generation sidearm with modified ergonomics and targeting systems. Again, his performance was solid, not spectacular by SEAL standards, but remarkably proficient for someone encountering the weapon for the first time. Stone observed with growing frustration. He had expected this station to highlight the limitations imposed by age and outdated training. Instead, it was demonstrating Will's exceptional ability to apply fundamental principles to new technology. When Will completed the rotation, his overall performance ranked in the upper half of the unit, not the highest scores, but far from the failure Stone had anticipated. Technology evolves, Will said quietly as he returned the final weapon to the rack. Human capability remains the constant factor. Stone didn't respond directly, but his expression made his thoughts clear. The next rotation would be more challenging. The limited visibility station proved more difficult. Operators were required to navigate a complex environment in near darkness, identifying friend from foe targets while moving at speed. Here, Will's performance was notably slower than the younger SEALs, though his accuracy remained comparable. Age affects night vision, Will acknowledged matter-of-factly to the instructor. Adaptation required. His candid assessment of his own limitations earned respectful nods from several SEALs. There was no defensiveness, no excuse-making, just honest recognition of reality and appropriate compensation. The final rotation presented the greatest challenge, the impaired function station, where operators simulated combat with various disabilities, one arm immobilized, restricted movement, impaired vision. This exercise tested not just skill but creative problem-solving under severe constraints. Will's performance here was exceptional. Where younger operators often attempted to power through limitations using their physical advantages, Will immediately adapted his approach to maximize efficiency within the imposed constraints. His solutions weren't always orthodox, but they were consistently effective. As the day's exercises concluded, the overall picture was becoming clear to the observant SEALs. The old man wasn't merely lucky or showing flashes of former prowess. He possessed a depth of knowledge and adaptability that transcended physical limitations. During the debriefing, Commander Jackson highlighted key observations from each station, noting exceptional performances and areas for improvement. When he reached the impaired function results, he specifically mentioned Will's unconventional but effective approaches. Mr. Sullivan demonstrated something critical today, Jackson noted. When standard procedures become impossible due to circumstantial limitations, the ability to improvise effectively can mean the difference between mission success and failure. Stone listened with rigid posture, his expression professionally neutral, despite his evident frustration. When Jackson concluded the formal debriefing, Stone announced the next day's primary exercise. Tomorrow we'll be conducting a full tactical scenario, a hostage rescue operation in a multi-level structure with unknown hostile count and civilian presence. You'll operate in 4-man teams employing all the skills we've been refining. His eyes found Will. Mr. Sullivan will participate with Team 2 serving as tactical advisor. His experience with historical operations may provide valuable perspective. The assignment wasn't random. Team 2 was composed of the unit's newer members less experienced and still developing their tactical coordination. By placing Will with them, Stone was effectively setting him up to share in their likely struggles against more seasoned teams. As the SEALs dispersed for the evening, Miller caught up with Will outside the facility. "Sir, I wanted to ask you something about tomorrow's exercise." Will nodded for him to continue. "I'm assigned to Team 2 as well." The scenario Stone described it sounds similar to something my grandfather once mentioned, an operation in Cambodia that wasn't supposed to exist. Will's expression revealed nothing, but he motioned Miller to walk with him away from potential listeners. "Your grandfather told you about classified operations?" Will asked once they were alone. "Not directly, but near the end when the cancer was bad and the medication made him confused, he talked about things. A village hostages, a rescue that went wrong until someone called Sullivan changed the plan." Will was silent for a long moment, looking out across the darkening base. "That was a long time ago." "It was you, wasn't it?" Miller pressed. "You were there with my grandfather." "Memory plays tricks as we age," Will said carefully, "especially with medication." But his non-denial was confirmation enough for Miller. "Sir, I've seen Stone's file. His father was Thomas Stone Force Recon, later joined an unnamed Special Operations Unit." This information clearly registered with Will, though his reaction was subtle, just a slight narrowing of his eyes. "There's a connection here that Stone doesn't know about, isn't there?" Miller asked. "Perhaps." Will finally turned to face the young SEAL directly. "But some connections are better left unexplored, especially when they involve operations that officially never happened." Miller nodded slowly, understanding the implied instruction to let the matter rest. "Yes, sir, I should go." As Miller departed, Will remained in place, watching the last light fade from the sky. Thomas Stone, a name from the past connected to memories Will had carefully compartmentalized decades ago. If Derek Stone was Thomas's son, that added layers of complexity to an already complicated situation. Later that evening, Will sat alone in his quarters examining the worn medallion he had looked at the night before. It wasn't a military issue, rather a simple silver disc and the date 1968, a gift from a village elder whose family had been rescued during an operation that, according to official records, had never occurred. A soft knock at his door interrupted his contemplation. When he opened it, he found Commander Jackson standing outside holding a bottle of bourbon and two glasses. "Thought you might appreciate some company," Jackson said, "and decent whiskey." Will stepped aside, allowing Jackson to enter. The commander poured 2 fingers into each glass and handed one to Will. "I was at the hand-to-hand session this morning," Jackson said, after taking a sip. Stone's quite shaken, though he'd never admit it. "Pride can be a dangerous vulnerability," Will observed, sampling the bourbon, "especially when it's been cultivated as thoroughly as his has been." Jackson settled into the room's single chair. "Stone is our best, absolutely committed, technically flawless, natural leader. But there are blind spots in his training gaps in his understanding. The modern military emphasis on technology and standardized doctrine," Will noted, "necessary for scale but sometimes limiting." Jackson nodded. "Exactly why you're here. This program isn't just about evaluating old techniques for possible incorporation into current training." Will raised an eyebrow, waiting for Jackson to continue. "The real objective is to identify what's been lost in our pursuit of technological solutions, to recognize the human elements that can't be replaced by advanced systems or artificial intelligence." "And Stone is the test case," Will surmised. "One of them. He represents our finest product, the perfect modern warrior. But recent operations have revealed concerning patterns. When technology fails or circumstances fall outside established parameters, even our best operators sometimes struggle to adapt." Will considered this. "And you believe I can help address this gap?" "Colonel Harris does. He was very specific about requesting you for this program." Will's expression shifted slightly at the mention of Harris. "How is Richard these days?" "You know Colonel Harris personally?" Jackson seemed surprised. "We've crossed paths." Will took another sip of bourbon. He was young, ambitious, paid attention to details others missed. Jackson studied Will with newfound curiosity. "He said something similar about you, actually. Called you the most observant operator he ever met." Will allowed himself a small smile. High praise from Richard. They sat in companionable silence for a moment before Jackson spoke again. Stone has planned something special for tomorrow. The hostage scenario isn't standard. He's modified it significantly, created complications designed to test the limits of conventional tactical approaches. Designed to prove his point, Will suggested. Precisely. He wants to demonstrate that modern problems require modern solutions, that historical approaches are inadequate for contemporary challenges. Will nodded thoughtfully. A reasonable hypothesis. Worth testing. Jackson finished his bourbon and stood. I should warn you, he specifically engineered this scenario to highlight the advantages of youth strength and technological proficiency, areas where he believes you're at a disadvantage. I appreciate the heads up, Will said, rising to see Jackson to the door. But disadvantages can be instructive in themselves. After Jackson departed, Will returned to his contemplation of the medallion, turning it over in his weathered hands. Tomorrow would indeed be challenging, not just physically, but strategically and psychologically. Stone was orchestrating a deliberate test, one designed to finally put the old man in his place. Will tucked the medallion away and began his evening stretching routine. Whatever tomorrow brought, he would face it with the same calm readiness that had carried him through decades of conflicts, both declared and undeclared. Morning arrived with a tension that permeated the training facility. The SEALs prepared their gear with focused precision, checking equipment, and reviewing standard operating procedures for hostage rescue operations. Team assignments had been posted, confirming Will's placement, with Team 2 for relatively inexperienced operators, including Miller. Stone gathered the unit for final briefing, his commanding presence drawing all eyes. Today's scenario simulates a high-risk hostage situation in hostile territory. The structure contains multiple rooms across 3 levels, with an unknown number of hostiles and at least 4 civilian hostages. He continued detailing the parameters: limited visibility potential, booby traps, a compressed time frame representing urgent extraction requirements. Communication will be restricted to simulate battlefield conditions. You'll need to rely on pre-mission planning and team coordination to succeed. As Stone elaborated on the specifics, Will listened attentively, noting the deliberate complexity of the scenario. This wasn't merely challenging, it was specifically designed to overwhelm conventional tactical approaches, forcing teams to choose between competing priorities under extreme pressure. The teams were given 30 minutes to develop their entry plans. Will observed as Team 2's designated leader, Lieutenant Cooper, outlined a standard approach focused on rapid room clearing and hostage identification. We'll enter through the west access point, clear the ground floor methodically, then proceed upward level by level, Cooper explained, marking positions on the facility diagram. We'll listen without comment until Cooper finished his presentation. A solid conventional approach, he acknowledged. May I offer an alternative perspective? Cooper nodded, curious, despite his evident skepticism. Will studied the diagram carefully. The scenario details suggest this is a deliberate ambush situation. Multiple levels unknown, hostile count, compressed time frame, all pointing to an environment designed to disadvantage conventional tactical movement. What would you suggest instead? Miller asked. Unconventional entry points, Will said, indicating several structural vulnerabilities. Split team approach with non-standard room clearing patterns, and most importantly, indirect initial movement. Indirect movement sacrifices speed, Cooper objected. The mission parameters specifically emphasize time constraints. Sometimes the fastest approach isn't the most direct, Will countered, especially when the direct route is the expected one. Cooper seemed unconvinced, but allowed Will to elaborate. As the older man outlined his alternative strategy, the team's skepticism gradually transformed into thoughtful consideration. His approach violated several standard operating procedures, but his reasoning was compelling, particularly his analysis of how hostiles would likely anticipate conventional tactics. When planning time concluded, Stone gathered the teams for final instructions. Teams will enter sequentially at 2-minute intervals. Team 1 will initiate, followed by Teams 2, 3, and 4. Performance metrics include time to completion, hostage survival rate, and operator survival rate. As Team 1 moved into position, Stone approached Team 2. His eyes scanned their equipment, pausing when he noticed unconventional arrangements that reflected Will's influence. Interesting modifications to standard gear positioning, he commented. Your planning took in creative direction. Cooper nodded respectfully. Yes, Master Chief, we've incorporated some alternative tactical considerations. Stone's gaze shifted to Will. Historical approaches have their place, but this scenario reflects contemporary threats requiring modern solutions. We'll see what works, Willow replied simply. Stone rejoined the control team as the exercise commenced. Team 1 entered the structure with textbook precision, moving rapidly through the initial rooms. Their progress was tracked on monitors visible to the waiting teams, allowing everyone to observe their approach. As predicted, Team 1 encountered significant resistance on the direct path to the hostage locations. Despite their skill and coordination, they were repeatedly forced into defensive positions, losing momentum and accumulating simulated casualties. When Team 2's entry window arrived, Cooper signaled for his team to implement Will's unorthodox approach. Rather than following Team 1's path, they utilized a maintenance access point, bypassing the areas of heaviest resistance. Inside the structure, the difference in methodology became immediately apparent. Where Team 1 had moved aggressively through main corridors, Team 2 progressed more methodically through service areas and secondary passages. Their pace appeared slower, but they encountered significantly less resistance. Will moved with the team not leading, but providing quiet guidance at critical junctures. When they approached the junction, where standard procedure would dictate clearing all adjoining spaces, he suggested an alternative bypass and continued toward the primary objective, leaving potential threats unaddressed temporarily. Calculated risk, he explained quietly. Mission priority is hostage recovery, not complete threat elimination. Cooper hesitated momentarily before accepting the suggestion. It contradicted his training, but something in Will's confidence was persuasive. The decision proved crucial. By bypassing secondary threats, Team 2 reached the first hostage location before any other team, extracting 2 civilian targets without encountering the heavy resistance that had stalled Team 1. Stone watched from the control room, his expression revealing growing concern as Team 2's unconventional approach yielded unexpected success. He had designed the scenario specifically to punish deviations from established doctrine, yet Will's team was progressing with remarkable efficiency. The final phase of the exercise presented the greatest challenge. The remaining hostages were held in a central location heavily guarded and with only limited access points. Team 1 had reached this area but was pinned down by simulated enemy fire, unable to advance without sustaining catastrophic casualties. Team 2 arrived at a secondary position overlooking the standoff. From their vantage point, the tactical situation appeared hopeless. Any direct assault would result in certain failure. Conventional approach isn't viable, Cooper assessed, turning to Will. Suggestions. Will studied the layout, mentally calculating angles and timing. Distraction and indirect action. We create a diversion to draw attention, then extract the hostages through an unexpected vector. What kind of diversion? Miller asked. The kind they won't ignore, Will replied, outlining a bold tactic that violated nearly every principle of conventional room clearing. Cooper weighed the proposal against his training. Standard procedure would dictate waiting for additional teams to arrive, establishing overwhelming force before attempting extraction. But the scenario's time constraints made such caution impractical. Let's do it, he decided. What followed was a masterclass in asymmetric tactics. Team 2 created a diversion that drew hostile attention away from the hostages, then executed an extraction through a route so unexpected that it encountered minimal resistance. Their approach wasn't faster in absolute terms, but it was dramatically more effective, preserving team integrity while successfully recovering all assigned hostages. By the time the exercise concluded, the results were undeniable. Team 2, guided by Will's unconventional approach, had achieved the highest hostage survival rate and lowest operator casualty count. Teams following standard tactical doctrine had performed significantly worse, despite their superior experience and physical capabilities. Stone's expression during the debriefing was a study in controlled frustration. Team 2's approach demonstrated certain advantages in this specific scenario, he acknowledged professionally. Their willingness to adapt standard procedures allowed them to overcome obstacles that challenged conventional tactics. It was as close to praise as he could manage, given that the outcome directly contradicted his expectations. The watching SEALs understood the significance. The old man's historical knowledge had proven more valuable than cutting-edge tactical doctrine. As the teams dispersed to clean and store their equipment, Stone approached Will privately. That was an impressive display of unconventional thinking, he said, his tone carefully neutral. Where did you develop those particular infiltration techniques? Various places, Will replied. When you're outnumbered and outgunned, you learn to create advantages where none seem to exist. Stone studied him with newfound intensity. Those weren't standard infantry tactics from any era I've studied. No, though, Will agreed without elaboration. Mr. Sullivan, Stone said after a moment, I think it's time we spoke candidly. Your presence here isn't coincidental, and your capabilities extend far beyond what your official record suggests. Will met his gaze steadily. What exactly are you asking, Master Chief? Before Stone could respond, Commander Jackson approached, interrupting their conversation. Excellent work today, both of you. Stone Central Command is requesting an immediate update on our progress. They're particularly interested in today's exercise results. Stone nodded, his expression professional once more. Right away, Commander. As Stone departed, Jackson turned to Will. That went rather differently than he anticipated. He's processing, Will observed, recalibrating his understanding. And his ego, Jackson added with a slight smile. Not an easy adjustment for someone who's never encountered a challenge he couldn't overcome through sheer determination and physical prowess. Will watched Stone's retreating figure. He's capable of growth. The question is whether his pride will allow it. Later that evening, as the facility quieted for the night, Miller sought out Will again. Sir, I wanted to thank you for today. That was the most educational exercise I've experienced since joining the program. Will nodded acknowledgement. Your team performed well, adapted quickly to unconventional approaches. Miller glanced around before continuing in a lower voice. I did some additional research after our conversation yesterday about my grandfather's unit and certain operations in Cambodia during 1968. Will's expression remained neutral, but his attention sharpened. Most records are still classified, Miller continued, but I've found references to a joint special operations task force that conducted a series of hostage rescues, operations that closely resemble what we practice today. Military history is full of such parallels, Will noted noncommittally. There's more, Miller pressed. I found a photograph in the archived news reports about one of the rescued American prisoners. A young Marine named Thomas Stone was among them. This revelation registered in Will's eyes a momentary flash of recognition, quickly masked. Master Chief Stone's father, Miller continued, he was one of the hostages your team rescued, wasn't he? Will was silent for a long moment before responding. Some operations remain classified for good reasons, Petty Officer Miller. Some connections are better left unexplored. Sir Stone has been pushing against your presence here from the beginning. If he knew the truth rarely simplifies matters, Will interrupted gently, especially when it contradicts long-held beliefs. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. Stone appeared around the corner, his expression darkening when he spotted them together. Miller, equipment inspection in 15 minutes, he said sharply. I suggest you prepare. Yes, Master Chief. Miller nodded respectfully to Will before departing. Stone remained studying Will with renewed intensity. You've made quite an impression on my men, Mr. Sullivan. They're receptive to new perspectives, Will replied, the mark of good training. Miller seems particularly interested in your experiences. Stone's tone carried a hint of accusation, almost as though there's some personal connection. He's curious about military history, Will said. Many young operators are. Stone's jaw tightened. Tomorrow's final exercise will be more demanding than anything we've done previously. A direct assessment of combat capabilities under maximum stress conditions. The challenge in his voice was unmistakable. This would be the decisive confrontation, Stone's attempt to definitively establish the superiority of modern training over historical experience. I look forward to it, Will said simply. As Stone turned to leave, he paused. One question, Mr. Sullivan. That infiltration technique you employed today, it closely resembled something my father once described. A rescue operation conducted by a unit that officially didn't exist. Will's expression revealed nothing. Military tactics often develop similar patterns independently, Master Chief. Convergent evolution applies to combat as well as biology. Stone studied him for a moment longer before nodding curtly and departing. But his final glance carried something new beneath the challenge and suspicion. A flicker of uncertainty had appeared. Will returned to his quarters, contemplating the accelerating complications. Miller's research had uncovered connections that were supposed to remain buried in classified archives. Stone was beginning to sense that Will's presence held deeper significance than a simple training exercise. Tomorrow would bring matters to a head, the final test Stone had designed specifically to prove his point once and for all. A direct combat assessment that would pit Will's experience and knowledge against Stone's physical prowess in modern training. As Will prepared for sleep, he removed medallion from his pocket, once more running his thumb over its worn surface. The memories it evoked were still vivid. After all these decades, the jungle heat, the gunfire, the desperate rush to reach captives before their execution. Among them, a young Marine named Thomas Stone, who would later father a son destined to become a SEAL commander. Will had never sought recognition for that operation, or dozens like it. Ghost operators existed in the shadows, their contributions recorded only in the most highly classified documents. But perhaps this final mission, this last opportunity to pass on what he had learned, required bringing at least some of those shadows into the light. Tomorrow would tell. One way or another, Master Chief Derek Stone would learn what William Sullivan had really come to teach. The training facility was transformed before dawn. When William Sullivan arrived for the day's final exercise, he found the main combat area had been configured into what resembled a ceremonial arena. Training mats covered the entire central space, surrounded by seating that would accommodate the entire SEAL unit and additional base personnel. This was no longer just a training exercise. It had become a demonstration, a public reckoning. Commander Jackson approached as Will surveyed the altered space. "This wasn't my idea," he said quietly. Stone requested a formal combat evaluation with witnesses. Will nodded, understanding the implications. "He needs to prove something publicly." Central Command approved it as the culmination of our Tactical Heritage Assessment Program. Jackson's tone suggested he had reservations. "Stone has invited senior officers from across the base to observe." Will showed no reaction beyond a slight nod. "Understandable. Public lessons often carry more weight." Jackson studied him with concern. "The physical demands will be substantial. Stone is half your age and at his peak condition." "Age brings its own advantages," Will replied simply. As they spoke, the facility began to fill. SEALs arrived first, followed by a stream of officers and instructors from other units. Stone had clearly promoted this event. Throughout the base, nearly 100 military personnel eventually filled the seating area, creating an atmosphere of anticipation more suited to a championship match than a training exercise. Stone entered last, dressed in standard combat training attire. His physical presence was imposing, powerfully built, moving with the fluid confidence of an elite warrior in his prime. He acknowledged the assembled audience with a professional nod before approaching Commander Jackson and Will at the center of the mat. "Gentlemen," Jackson addressed them, "today's exercise will be a comprehensive evaluation of combat effectiveness under maximum stress conditions. The objective is educational to compare different approaches to combat training and tactical doctrine." Stone's expression remained neutral, but his eyes betrayed his intensity as he looked at Will. "I appreciate Mr. Sullivan's willingness to participate in this final assessment. His contributions this week have been enlightening." Will met his gaze steadily. "Looking forward to our continued exchange of perspectives, Master Chief." Jackson outlined the parameters of the exercise, a full contact combat demonstration with minimal safety restrictions. The objective was to demonstrate tactical superiority through either submission or decisive advantage. In essence, it was as close to actual combat as possible within a controlled environment. As Jackson concluded his briefing, Stone addressed the assembled audience. "What you'll witness today is more than a physical contest. It's a comparison of combat philosophies, modern tactical doctrine, versus historical approaches." His confidence was absolute, his message clear. This would be the definitive demonstration of why contemporary training had superseded older methods. Will removed his outer shirt, revealing a simple gray t-shirt. His physique, while remarkably fit for his age, stood in stark contrast to Stone's powerful build. The scars across his arms and visible at his collar told their own story of a lifetime of service and survival. One of the base medical officers approached Will quietly. "Sir, I should note my professional concern about this exercise, given the age differential." "Appreciated, Doctor," Will responded with a slight smile, "but unnecessary." The combat area cleared, leaving only Will and Stone at the center, Commander Jackson between them. "This demonstration begins on my signal and concludes when one participant submits or I determine a decisive advantage has been established." Jackson stepped back. "Commence." Stone assumed a modern combative stance, balanced mobile hands positioned to both strike and defend. Will settled into a more traditional posture, lower and more stable. The contrast in their approaches was immediately evident to even the least experienced observers. Stone began circling, evaluating, looking for openings. Will remained centered, rotating only enough to maintain his orientation toward his opponent. Neither rushed to engage, Stone respecting Will's demonstrated capabilities, Will conserving energy for the coming exchange. The silence in the facility was absolute. Every eye focused on the two men, sensing that they were witnessing something significant. Stone initiated the first exchange with a rapid series of strikes designed to test Will's defensive capabilities. His technique was flawless, precise, powerful movements, executing modern military combatives with textbook perfection. Will's defense was unlike anything most present had seen before. He didn't attempt to match Stone's speed or power, instead employing minute shifts in position and timing that caused most of Stone's strikes to miss by millimeters or connect with less than full force. Notice the economy of movement, Stone narrated to the audience while maintaining his assault, a fundamental principle in all effective combat systems. Will remained silent, focused entirely on the engagement. His expression never changed, his breathing remained steady, and his eyes tracked Stone's movements with unwavering attention. As the initial exchange concluded, Stone reset his position, reassessing. The outcome wasn't what he had expected. Despite his superior speed and strength, he had failed to establish any significant advantage. In prolonged engagements, conditioning becomes increasingly critical, Stone commented, increasing the intensity of his next assault. This time, his approach was more aggressive, combining strikes with grappling attempts designed to exploit his strength advantage. Will responded by redirecting rather than opposing force, directly using Stone's momentum to maintain separation and create counter opportunities. The assembled SEALs watched with growing amazement. They had expected the old man to be overwhelmed quickly by Stone's physical advantages. Instead, they were witnessing a master class in combat efficiency. Will never wasted motion, never exerted more force than necessary, and somehow anticipated Stone's tactics with uncanny precision. Several senior officers leaned forward in their seats, their expressions shifting from polite interest to genuine fascination. This wasn't the one-sided demonstration they had anticipated. Stone, recognizing that his standard approach was proving ineffective, shifted tactics. He increased his movement, trying to force Will to expend energy, tracking and repositioning. It was a sound strategy against an older opponent attempting to exploit the endurance differential that age inevitably created. For several minutes, this new approach seemed effective. Will was forced to move more, and subtle signs of increased exertion became visible. Stone pressed his advantage, gradually closing distance and preparing for a decisive engagement. Fatigue compromises technique. Stone noted his confidence returning as he sensed Will's increasing respiratory rate. Combat effectiveness ultimately depends on physical capability. The statement seemed destined for immediate validation as Stone launched a perfectly executed combination that should have overwhelmed Will's defense. But at the critical moment, Will's response changed. Where he had been defensive, he suddenly advanced, stepping inside Stone's attack with a counter so perfectly timed it appeared almost prescient. The result was electric. Stone found himself momentarily off balance, his carefully constructed attack disrupted by a technique he had never encountered. Will didn't press the advantage, instead returning to his centered position, once again conserving energy. A murmur ran through the audience. The dynamic had shifted perceptibly. Stone's expression hardened as he recognized the tactical message Will had sent. I could have ended this, but chose not to. Interesting counter, Stone acknowledged, his voice tight. Unorthodox, but effective in this controlled environment. Will remained silent, his focus unwavering. Stone reset and launched his next assault with increased intensity. His technique remained excellent, but observers noted a subtle change, a heightened emotional investment that hadn't been present before. The contest had become personal. What followed was a masterful display of contrasting combat philosophies. Stone employed every advanced technique in the modern special operations arsenal, combinations designed for maximum effectiveness based on contemporary battlefield experience. His execution was flawless, his physical capabilities exceptional. Will's response represented an entirely different tradition. Movements rooted in centuries of combat experience, refined through multiple wars and countless life-or-death encounters. Where Stone was dynamic and powerful, Will was economical and precise. Where Stone attacked with overwhelming force, Will redirected and countered with minimal exertion. The longer the engagement continued, the more fascinating it became to the expert observers. They were witnessing not just a physical contest between individuals, but a comparison of entire combat paradigms, modern tactical doctrine versus historical wisdom distilled through experience. Stone's frustration became increasingly evident as his advantages failed to produce the expected results. His breathing had become more labored, not from physical exhaustion, but from the psychological strain of failing to dominate an opponent he had initially dismissed. In actual combat conditions, Stone said between exchanges, these academic demonstrations give way to operational realities. Will spoke for the first time since the demonstration began. Combat is never academic to the combatants. Something in his quiet statement triggered a shift in Stone's approach. His next attack abandoned some of the technical precision in favor of increased aggression, a more primal response rooted in his determination to prove his superiority once and for all. This was the moment Will had been waiting for. As Stone committed fully to his assault, Will executed a counter that exploited the younger man's overcommitment. The movement wasn't flashy or dramatic, just a perfectly timed redirection combined with precise application of force at Stone's most vulnerable point. The impact was decisive. Stone felt a sharp pain in his rib cage as Will's strike connected with surgical precision. The force wasn't excessive, but the placement was perfect, directly targeting the intercostal space between two ribs. Stone stumbled backward, his breath catching from both pain and shock. Medical training told him immediately what had happened, at least one cracked rib, possibly two. The injury wasn't severe, but the message was unmistakable. In a real combat situation, this could have been fatal. The facility fell silent as the audience processed what they had witnessed. The unthinkable had occurred. Their elite commander had been decisively countered by an elderly man they had initially dismissed as irrelevant. Commander Jackson stepped forward. That concludes our demonstration. Thank you both for this exceptional display of tactical capabilities. His diplomatic phrasing couldn't mask the reality. Will had prevailed not through superior strength or speed, but through perfect technique, timing, and tactical judgment. Stone straightened, masking his discomfort through sheer discipline. He extended his hand to Will, a gesture of professional respect, despite the unexpected outcome. Impressive technique, Mr. Sullivan. Will accepted the handshake. You fought well, Master Chief. As medical personnel approached to examine Stone, the facility doors opened suddenly. Every head turned as General Reynolds entered, accompanied by two staff officers. The four-star insignia on his uniform immediately commanded attention, bringing all military personnel present to their feet. As you were, Reynolds said, his authoritative voice carrying across the facility. He approached the center of the training area where Will stood with Stone and Commander Jackson. Protocol demanded that Will as a civilian remain in place while the officers exchanged salutes. But to everyone's surprise, General Reynolds walked directly to Will and rendered a crisp, formal salute. Lieutenant Colonel Sullivan, Reynolds said, it's an honor to finally meet you in person. The facility erupted in confused murmurs. Lieutenant Colonel, the assembled SEALs exchanged bewildered glances. Stone, despite his injury, straightened further, his expression reflecting stunned disbelief. General, Will acknowledged, returning the salute with the precision of someone for whom the gesture had never lost its significance. Reynolds turned to address the assembled personnel. Gentlemen, I apologize for the theatrical entrance, but the timing seemed appropriate. What you've witnessed today is more significant than a simple training demonstration. He gestured to Will. This is Lieutenant Colonel William Sullivan, United States Army, retired. His complete service record remains largely classified, but I've been authorized to inform you that Colonel Sullivan served as the founder and primary combat instructor of a specialized unit that operated from 1956 through 1984. Reynolds continued, this unit, known only by its unofficial designation, Ghost Operators, conducted over 300 missions across 17 countries. Colonel Sullivan personally led 74 of those operations, including 17 hostage rescues, with a success rate unmatched in special operations history. The revelation sent shockwaves through the audience. Stone's expression transformed from surprise to something more complex, confusion, reassessment, and the dawning realization that there was far more to Will Sullivan than anyone had imagined. Colonel Sullivan's contributions to Special Operations doctrine remain classified at the highest levels, Reynolds explained. But many of the techniques you employ today originated from his field innovations. His unit pioneered tactics that later became standard procedure across special operations communities. Reynolds turned to Stone. Master Chief Stone, you've had the rare privilege of testing your skills against one of the most significant combat instructors in modern military history. Few have had that opportunity. Stone stood rigid despite his injury processing this unexpected information. Sir, I'm grateful for the experience. He managed his professionalism, asserting itself despite his evident shock. Reynolds nodded, then addressed the group again. Colonel Sullivan agreed to participate in this program not to prove superiority of historical methods, but to demonstrate the enduring principles that transcend technological and doctrinal evolution. He turned to Will. Colonel, I believe you had a specific purpose in accepting this assignment. Would you care to address the men? Will stepped forward, his unassuming presence now transformed by the revelation of his true identity. When he spoke, his voice carried the natural authority of someone who had led men in the most demanding circumstances imaginable. What you witnessed today wasn't a contest between old and new, or between individuals, he began. It was a demonstration of principles that remain constant regardless of era or technology. Will looked directly at Stone. Master Chief Stone exemplifies the finest qualities of today's special operators: technical excellence, physical capability, and unwavering commitment. His approaches are tactically sound and represent the culmination of decades of doctrinal evolution. Stone straightened slightly at this unexpected praise. My purpose here wasn't to challenge modern methods, but to highlight what sometimes gets lost in our pursuit of technological solutions and standardized doctrine. Will continued. Combat remains fundamentally human. When systems fail, when technology disappoints, when circumstances fall outside established parameters, that's when the timeless principles become most critical. Will address the broader audience. Adaptability trumps doctrine. Efficiency supersedes power. Observation prevails over aggression. These aren't historical curiosities, they're eternal truths that apply as much on today's battlefields as they did in previous conflicts. As Will spoke, Reynolds signaled to one of his aides, who stepped forward with a worn leather folder. The general took it and turned to face Stone directly. Master Chief Stone, there's another reason for my presence today. Reynolds opened the folder, revealing several aged photographs and yellowed papers. These documents relate to a classified operation conducted in Cambodia in February 1968. Stone's expression shifted subtly, recognition flickering in his eyes. Operation Distant Thunder was officially recorded as a limited reconnaissance mission, Reynolds continued. In reality, it was a hostage extraction involving 17 American prisoners. Reynolds handed one of the photographs to Stone. It showed a group of emaciated men being helped into a helicopter by soldiers in unmarked uniforms. The third man from the left, Reynolds said quietly. Stone stared at the photo, his face draining of color. That's my father. Reynolds nodded. Then Lieutenant Thomas Stone, Force Recon, captured during a separate operation and held for 63 days before extraction. Stone looked up from the photograph, his eyes finding Will with new understanding. You were there. I led the extraction team. Will confirmed, his voice gentle. Your father fought alongside us after we reached him despite his condition. Saved 2 of my men during the exfiltration. Reynolds extended another document to Stone. This is the after-action report, declassified specifically for this moment. The mission was considered impossible by conventional assessment. 17 hostages held in a heavily fortified location, surrounded by superior enemy forces with no viable extraction route. Stone scanned the document, his tactical mind immediately grasping the extraordinary challenges the operation had presented. Colonel Sullivan planned and executed the extraction using methods that contradicted every established doctrine, Reynolds explained. His team infiltrated through routes considered impassable, employed unconventional tactics that confused enemy forces, and extracted every prisoner without losing a single operator. Will watched Stone's expression as the younger man processed this information, the realization that his very existence depended on the unconventional thinking he had spent the week dismissing. Your father wrote to Colonel Sullivan every year on the anniversary of that extraction, Reynolds added, handing Stone a small bundle of letters tied with faded string. He understood what had been accomplished that day. Stone accepted the letters with uncharacteristic uncertainty, his confident demeanor replaced by a vulnerability few had ever witnessed in the elite SEAL commander. "Why wasn't I told?" he asked quietly. "The operation remained classified until recently," Reynolds explained, "and your father respected operational security too much to violate it even with his family." Will stepped forward. "Your father was an extraordinary Marine Master Chief. His courage during that extraction was something I have never forgotten." Stone met Will's gaze, the antagonism of previous days replaced by a complex mixture of emotions. "Thank you," he said simply, "for my father and for all of them." Will nodded, acknowledging the moment's weight. Reynolds addressed the assembly once more. "Gentlemen, what you've witnessed this week isn't a rejection of modern tactical doctrine, but a reminder of its foundations. Colonel Sullivan's participation in this program was specifically requested to help us identify elements of special operations heritage that remain relevant to contemporary challenges." The general turned to Commander Jackson. "The program will continue with Colonel Sullivan serving as a special advisor on the integration of historical techniques into current training protocols." Jackson nodded. "We'd be honored to have his continued involvement, sir." As the formal proceedings concluded, the assembled personnel were dismissed to their regular duties. Stone was escorted to the medical facility for treatment of his injured ribs, the bundle of his father's letters clutched in his hand. Will remained behind with General Reynolds watching as the facility gradually emptied. "That was quite a demonstration," Reynolds commented, "though perhaps more decisive than we had intended." "Sometimes clear lessons require clear results," Will replied. Reynolds smiled slightly. "Stone will recover both physically and professionally. Men like him adapt quickly when presented with undeniable evidence." "He has exceptional potential," Will agreed, "once he balances his technical excellence with broader perspective." "That's precisely why we orchestrated this entire exercise," Reynolds said. "Stone represents our most promising next-generation leadership. His influence on special operations doctrine will be substantial." Will nodded thoughtfully. He needed to learn that lesson directly, not theoretically. Some truths can only be demonstrated, not explained. 6 months later, the training facility at Fort Bragg hosted a different kind of gathering. A specialized course on advanced tactical integration had concluded, and the graduating operators were receiving their certificates from Master Chief Stone and Colonel Sullivan. Stone had recovered fully from his physical injury. More significantly, he had undergone a profound professional evolution. The arrogance that had characterized his earlier approach had been replaced by something more valuable: the confident humility of a leader who understood both his capabilities and his limitations. The training program they had developed together combined the best elements of modern tactical doctrine with timeless principles drawn from historical experience. It emphasized adaptability over rigid procedure, observation over aggression, and comprehensive tactical thinking over reliance on technological advantages. After the ceremony concluded, Stone found Will in his office, packing the few personal items he had accumulated during his extended stay at the base. "Heading back to retirement?" Stone asked, leaning against the doorframe. His posture was relaxed, the tension that had defined their early interactions long since resolved. "For now," Will replied, "until the next generation needs reminding of what the previous ones learned." Stone nodded, understanding. "I've been meaning to ask you something. That day during our demonstration, you could have ended it much earlier, couldn't you?" Will considered the question. The objective wasn't to win, but to teach. And the broken ribs, were those part of the lesson? A slight smile crossed Will's weathered face. "Some lessons need to leave a mark to be remembered." Stone laughed despite himself, his hand unconsciously moving to his side where the injury had healed. "Mission accomplished, Colonel." Will closed his small duffel bag and turned to face Stone fully. "Your father would be proud of what you've built here." Stone's expression softened. "I've been reading his letters. He mentioned you often, though, never by name. Always referred to you as the man who taught me what real leadership means." Will nodded, accepting this with characteristic modesty. "I have something for you," Stone said, retrieving a small object from his pocket. "My father carried this from the day you rescued him until his death." He extended his hand, revealing a worn combat knife with distinctive markings on the handle. "He told me it was given to him by someone who saved more than just his life that day. I think he'd want you to have it back." Will accepted the knife, recognition and memory flowing across his features. I gave this to him during exfiltration when we encountered unexpected resistance. He used it well. He told me that story many times, Stone said. Never mentioned Cambodia or classified operations, just that a good leader had trusted him with a weapon when he needed it most. Will turned the knife in his hands, memories from decades past still vivid. Sometimes trust is the most powerful weapon we can deploy. Stone extended his hand. Thank you, Colonel, for what you did for my father and for what you've taught me. Will grasped Stone's hand firmly. The lessons continue both ways, Master Chief. Your father would be proud of the leader you have become. As Will departed the facility, he passed the training area where a new group of SEALs was being instructed by both veteran operators and younger instructors. The curriculum now explicitly incorporated elements from multiple generations of combat experience, creating a synthesis of historical wisdom and contemporary application. Outside, Miller waited beside a base vehicle assigned to transport Will to the airport. All set, Colonel, the young SEAL asked, taking Will's bag. Ready when you are, Will replied. As they drove, Miller gestured toward a group of SEALs running an innovative obstacle course that combined elements from different eras of special operations training. Stone's really transformed the program. Retention rates are up 40%, and operational performance metrics have improved across every category. Will nodded, watching the young operators navigate challenges designed to develop both physical capabilities and adaptive thinking. He found his balance. The other instructors call it the Sullivan Principle now, Miller added with a smile. The idea that age and evolution don't necessarily negate foundational wisdom. Will allowed himself a small smile at this unexpected legacy. There are worse things to be remembered for. As they approached the main gate, Will removed the medallion from his pocket one final time, studying its worn surface in the afternoon sunlight. The mission that had begun over 50 years ago in a jungle clearing had come full circle. The lessons learned in blood had been preserved and transmitted to a new generation of warriors. He returned the medallion to his pocket as the base receded behind them. His final mission was complete. The knowledge he had gained through decades of service would continue to protect American operators long after his own story concluded. Some lessons transcended time, technology, and doctrine. Some truths remained constant across generations. And sometimes the most valuable weapon in any warrior's arsenal wasn't found in their equipment, but in the wisdom passed down from those who had walked the path before them. The old soldier settled back in his seat, content in the knowledge that his legacy would endure not in medals or official records, but in the lives that would be saved by what he had taught, the final mission of a man who had always understood that true victory wasn't measured in battles won, but in wisdom preserved.